Welcome back in Live Now. I'm Austin Westfall. You just watched some of it. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance said during a visit to Greenland on Friday that Denmark has underinvested in Greenland security and demanded that Denmark change its approach as President Trump pushes to take over the Danish territory. Vance and the Second Lady visited Bidukvik Space Force Base in Greenland on Friday, which is the U.S.'s northernmost military base. It was -3 degrees Fahrenheit when the Veep landed. He met with U.S. service members and underscored the importance of Arctic security during the speech. To discuss more, national security analyst and host of the Strat podcast, Hal Kempfer is here. As always, Hal, it's good to see you. There's a few things I want to hit about this, because this is a fascinating one. So the U.S. wants Greenland, but Denmark doesn't want to entertain that discussion. So is there actually anything the U.S. can do about that, Hal? Is there any more leverage that the U.S. can lever? Or are a provocative visit like this, is that the only thing the U.S. can do at this point?
Well, Austin, obviously you can see there are provocative visits like this. Originally, Usha Vance, the Second Lady, was going to go to Newark, much further south, by the way, I should mention. By the way, in Bidukvik, at the Space Force Base, that's that particular weather, 3 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, is considered a balmy day. I want to clarify that. But much further south, she was going to go down. She's going to go to this, I think it's like the Great Arctic Sled Dog Race or something. It's a big sled dog race they have annually up there. And she was going to meet with local Greenland politicians, and that just did not work out. None of the politicians really want to meet or greet her when she came in. It was just considered kind of political suicide to do so at this point. And even the dog sled race was, pardon the expression, getting cold feet on the whole thing. And the travel agent that was setting it up actually pulled out and said, look, we don't want to deal with this. So you get a sense for the politics in Greenland's capital city that this is a very tense issue. You got to remember that, yes, a lot of the people up there are native, I guess you could say Eskimos. That's a wrong term, but native peoples that have been up there for as near as I can figure 4,500 years or something like that. But with that, there are a lot of folks that live in Greenland that actually their families harken back to Denmark. So there's really strong Danish ties culturally across the board with Greenland and Denmark. And the recent election was that despite the strong independence streak of the Greenlanders, they did not vote for the party that wanted to accelerate that. They voted for the party that wanted to very much slow roll the independence movement, which is another way of saying they weren't all that thrilled with the idea of affiliating with the U.S. So there's limits. I can't imagine a military operation the U.S. invading Greenland to take it forcibly from Denmark. That would be very strange, to say the least. But if Greenland was to become independent, which they could, they are a self-ruled autonomous territory. And if they declared independence, as other self-ruled autonomous territories have, and I would point to the former U.S. territories in the Pacific, they're now the compact states, that yes, they could become independent, and then they could decide if they want to affiliate with the U.S. for national security and defense matters, much like those former U.S. territories did in the Pacific under the compact states arrangement.
Right. So you host a podcast called Strat. You're all about strategy, strategic risk. What's the strategic advantage to the U.S. having territory like Greenland? Why do they want it? And perhaps more importantly, why don't the Danish want to give it up?
Well, the Danes, some would say that the Danes have been kind of absentee landlords in a way. They don't have a lot of resources. Denmark is a relatively small country, less than 7 million people. They don't have a very large military. They've never had a very large military. They have a military that one would say it would have a tough time defending Denmark proper, let alone its overseas possessions. And if you go back to World War II, when the Nazis basically overran Denmark in very short order in the war, that an agreement was made for the U.S. to basically defend Danish territories outside of Denmark, and Greenland was the largest territory that fell into this. And so the U.S. has been basically defending Greenland militarily since World War II. I don't think we ever stopped. 1951, we codified that agreement. Of course, when Denmark became part of NATO, Greenland fell under the NATO agreement as well. But the U.S. defends Denmark. So I mean, defends Denmark, but it defends Greenland, and it always has defended Greenland. So why is it so important now? Is with climate change, it's become a much more important area. And one of the reasons it's so important is because during certain parts of the year, the fabled Northwest Passage is an actual thing. Ships can go north over Canada and back down through the Bering Strait, and they can cut off thousands of miles, tremendous amounts of money doing that. And the Greenlanders themselves say, hey, look, we're becoming as important as the Suez Canal or Panama as a shortcut for maritime shipping, which is true certain parts of the year, not year round, but certain parts of the year that's very true, which means they're very strategic in terms of global trade, global shipping. Then they also have phenomenal resources that are becoming easier to extract with the receding ice sheets, so they can get in there. They can mine. They got rare earths. They got lithium, gold, you name it. They have got phenomenal mineral wealth. Of course, they've got oil and gas trapped that they can develop as well. So that's absolutely important. And then, of course, and certainly President Trump would appreciate this as a real estate developer: location, location, location. They're on the Arctic. The Arctic is an area of great global competition. The Chinese, even though they're technically not an Arctic nation per se, are heavily involved in trying to dominate the Arctic, working with Russia on this. Hence, they have become more important. And by the way, you don't get the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap without Greenland. All right.
Right.
And so that's a critical maritime gap. That's where back in the Cold War, the Soviet submarines would sneak through that gap to go and sit off the U.S. coast with their nuclear missile carrying submarine fleet. So it's absolutely critical from a number of things. And the reality is that Denmark militarily can't really defend Greenland.
That
Only
was
the
actually
U.S.
going to
has
be
that
my next,
ability.
and that's that point is something you sent me an article about earlier today. The former U.S. ambassador to Denmark, her name is Carla Sands, argues that Denmark cannot defend Greenland. But that raises a question to me, Hal. Who does Greenland need to be protected from? China? Others?
Well, that's the U.S. argument, is that Russia and China pose a threat, and this ever hegemonic, encroaching China with its global, Belt and Road Initiative and all the other things it's doing around the world poses a bigger and bigger threat all around. And of course, they're very concerned that China may do what it's done in so many other parts of the world, which is get in there through nefarious different means with treaties, or not so much treaties, but with contracts and under various shell corporations, things like that. Next thing you know, they're going to lock up all the mineral wealth that's up in Greenland. And we saw them do this with the rare earths around the world, where they did it took decades, but they did a bunch of things where basically they pushed the U.S. out of the rare earths mining and processing business altogether. Very strategic in terms of how they did that. And so they're looking at Greenland and say, hey, look, the U.S. needs to have a bigger footprint there. That's the argument for it. The other argument, though, is Greenland belongs to Greenlanders. And the Greenlanders are okay with Denmark having territorial control. There is no great opposition to that. The Danes have always been tremendous allies. During the War on Terror, they had troops that were overseas, particularly in Afghanistan. I think they took more combat deaths per capita than any NATO country, I think, to include the U.S. And so they have definitely made a huge contribution. They have always been staunch U.S. allies across the board. We've always had a phenomenal, close, positive relationship with Denmark going back forever. We actually purchased, back in the days when they used to purchase lands, we purchased the U.S. Virgin Islands from Denmark. They were a Danish territory. We actually acquired them. And actually in that agreement, there's language in there where we basically make no claims on Greenland territory under that agreement, where we say we allow Denmark to assert sovereign control over Greenland. And in that, there are some that are looking at that saying, Well, if we gave them that permission, then it was our permission to give. So therefore, they're kind of trying to imply that we could take that back and somehow do some sort of de jure claim of Greenland. One would have to be very creative in the history of Greenland to come up with some way that the U.S. actually ever owned Greenland. But it is a rather interesting history that we've had with Greenland as far as our national security, national defense commitment there, and everything we've done. We even built an under ice city with a nuclear power plant, believe it or not, in the 50s and 60s that was supposed to have nuclear missiles that we could fire into Russia. So we could basically fire them and the Russians wouldn't even know they're there. And we would, if there was a nuclear war, we'd fire these things. They'd land in Russia in less than half the time it would take to launch from the U.S. And when I say secret, it was secret. Apparently, we didn't even tell the Danes that we were building this under ice nuclear powered city. It's just a phenomenal history that we had. And there's also a little bit of history is we may have had a B-52 crash and dropped a nuclear weapon in Greenland, and it's not clear if we've actually recovered all those nuclear weapons that we lost. And there is an area that has a lot of plutonium, radioactive exposure, and that's an issue with the people who used to live in the area near the Space Force base. So anyway, a very interesting history the U.S. has had.
One more thing before we go here. Is there anything to lose here? Let's say the U.S. Keeps saying what it's saying. The Trump administration keeps up with the rhetoric and perhaps with these provocative types of trips, as we saw today. Is there anything that the Danes can take away from us? Can they perhaps shutter the northernmost U.S. military base? Can they do other things in order to get back at us?
It's an interesting proposition. They don't actually have the physical ability that I can see to shutter the base. They could try and say, hey, we're pulling out of the defense agreement. They could do a lot of things. Really, what the Danes have is influence, and they have influence in Europe and NATO and Scandinavia. And so what they could do is this could be it's already starting to become a point of contention between Europe and the United States, is this claim of Greenland taking away from a European NATO country, or trying to take it away from a European NATO country. That just creates more tension between the U.S. and Europe, the U.S. and NATO, the U.S. and the European Union. And so not so much directly, but indirectly, they could do a number of things that could cause a lot of pressure on the U.S. So that is something that is possible. But if you look at the history of Denmark and Greenland, it's not perfect. I will tell you that I don't think the U.S. history with the Native Americans, the U.S. government history is very imperfect by a long stretch. And there's a rather difficult history with Denmark and how it's dealt with the native peoples in Greenland. So that's one thing the U.S. is pointing out, although I find that a rather difficult argument when you look at the U.S. history as well in the same regard.
Al, we'll leave it there for now. Of course, we look forward to the Strat podcast. You and I will be taping an episode in about a week's time. We'll see you then, and anybody can listen to the Strat podcast anywhere the podcasts are available. Have a good weekend. We'll talk soon.
Okay. Thank you, Austin.